Would choose social work. Into
Okay, can you hear me? Can you see me? Well, it's great to be here, and it's fantastic to see a full room of people and to see old friends. I was just talking to Mark earlier, who does some support, and we worked together in the early days of the Principal Social Worker Network when he was chairing it, so it's fantastic to see that involvement. And I was just talking to Nick earlier, who's a very old friend of mine, and I'm definitely the warm-up act for Nick, so don't get too bored because the excitement is coming. So I have got, actually, if you can hold up my annual report there, just I've got some copies, copies of my annual report, which in a sense kind of captures what we're trying to do around really pushing practice towards a much more strengths-based approach across the country, and there are lots of examples in my annual report, so it's available online, so do have a look at it. And there is a video clip in there that Wigan have done, because they've been on this journey for quite a few years, and you've got social workers talking on the film about how it's improved their work with their citizens and how it's improved their working lives. So do have a look at the annual report and come and grab one of the very precious few hard copies if you're interested. Obviously that's my name and that's my role. I am on Twitter. I was really surprised. Who said they were on Twitter? Put your hands right up. Don't be, yeah, great. Well, it'd be great. I know it's a bit of a pain, all this social media stuff, but the Twitter opportunities are quite good, because if you just follow me, for example, then you will every day get a link to something that we're trying to do in terms of practice, in terms of updating around what's happening around policy, some of the debates around social work, and some of the links to research or interesting things that are going on, not just in the UK but across the world. And also I'm desperate for new followers, because Isabel Trowler, the chief children's social worker, has got about 2,000 more followers than me. That's not right, is it? She is more controversial, of course, but anyway. And that's the email if you want to email me directly. So for me, thinking about strengths-based approaches is really going back to my roots as a social worker. When community social work, when engaging with people in their communities and thinking about theories of community development and how you get alongside people, was at the core of social work training and practice when I first went off from my course many years ago. So we're sort of rediscovering it now, aren't we? But it's got to be fit for the 21st century as well. And last night I went to hear Hilary Cotton talk. I don't know if any of you have heard of her, but she's a sort of social activist, and started off with some of the early experiments around kind of community circles for older people. I forget what they're called now, but anyway, different ways of getting into communities and living and experiencing what it was like to be in that community, and what were the potential possibilities, and how you worked alongside people to look at self-generated solutions, which is, the core of radical social work, really. So we're trying to get back to that, but trying to fit it into your role within state services as local authority social care workers. And when I say social work, I'm talking about social work practice. So obviously, as qualified social workers, that's expected of you, but also everybody involved in social care, in local authority social services departments or social care departments, whatever we call them these days, is concerned with the values of social work and social care practice, and ensuring that we really are human rights, citizenship-oriented practitioners who are working with people around self-determination and choice and control, social justice. And we work with some of the most vulnerable and marginalised people, so that's why we do what we do. So as I talk about social workers, I'm meaning all of us, but there's a particular responsibility on regulated professionals. So why is it important? Well, I think I sort of summarised it there, that we've talked about person-centred work and personalisation and all these kind of whatever you call them, strap lines that we've used over the years. But what is it really about? And I think sometimes we try and create a kind of architecture to fit it all into, and it suddenly becomes very transactional and processy. But it comes back to, it's about people and relationships and relationship building and trust and confidence, and that's what we should all be exemplifying. That's our unique selling point. And starting with what matters to people, what's important to them, having a more strengths-led and based approach to working with people, rather than what we were forced into, I have to say, through the assessment and care management models up until the Care Act came in, which was about deficits. You know, what's wrong, what can't you do, what box can I tick so I can get you something. So trying to move away from what was essentially actually quite a health-driven way of thinking about people, their symptoms, and how do we kind of sort them out. So getting back to people, relationships, how you really do work alongside people, but really start with what matters to them. And also look at how you deal with the power relationship between you. Now, sometimes social workers will say to me, I feel I've no power, you know, I'm just kind of squeezed all the time. But when you walk through the door into somebody's house, into that privilege of their intimate lives, you have a lot of power. And I was with my elderly mum a few weeks ago, and it was actually the community nurse who came to visit her because she's very poorly. And that whole change in the way in which when somebody comes into somebody's life like that, the kind of reluctance to feel confident about saying what really matters to you and what will help and what won't help, because the professional is the expert. So we've really got to change that round, because obviously people are the experts in their own lives, and we've got to start with what matters and what they know about themselves. So I won't go through all of those, but I think it is about what matters rather than what's wrong. How do we build on that, and what's possible, and who cares about it? You know, it's not like what's the problem, how will we fix it? What's possible here, and who's involved and in this person's social network, even if sometimes it doesn't appear as though they would be significant. Sometimes it can be the post office worker who might occasionally knock on the person's door to deliver something, who can build a relationship in a way that's just about checking in. Those are the kind of things we need to think about. What's in the community? I know Vic will say a lot more about that. But the Care Act gave us the big opportunity to shift away from that assessment, care plan, review, transactional processing, procedural type approach, back to the key principle of people's well-being is the most important thing, and thinking about really taking that strengths-based approach to assessing and how we work with people to understand what matters, but also what sort of interventions or support we put in place. So one of the key features of strengths-based approaches, well, one of the things I think in adult social care, and one of the things that you as practitioners can bring, is a positive attitude towards risk enablement and risk-taking, that people have whole lives, that it's not just them and their disability or their mental illness problem, they've got a whole lot of other things going on for them. So thinking about the whole person, their whole life approach, and being much more balanced about it, and looking at capabilities and building on those capabilities and helping people to grow their capabilities. So really engaging with both the person, their family, and also often the families themselves have vulnerabilities that you have to work with. It's not just the individual. So the identification of strengths, and some of those are soft, the personal qualities, the skills, the interests the person's had, and some of them are hard. Some, people do have sometimes resources that they could be better utilising in terms of their finances or their housing options and so on. But building resilience and well-being, I think, and positive stories about what can be achieved. I was recently in Australia, which is where I come from, in case you can identify my twang, and there's a big movement around strengths-based, asset-based approaches in social work up there, down there. And I went on a visit with one of the practitioners who was working with a community who lived on a caravan park. So I suppose it's the equivalent to, is it caravan parks here? I suppose it is, static caravan type things. And it was seen for many years, over generations, as a real problem place. All the kind of troubled families type issues, as we call it here. And lots of needs analysis have been done, and lots of, over the years, many solutions and loads of investment. And essentially, not really much change. And they decided to completely change the way they were going to work and use this very strengths-based, asset-based community development type approach. Went and lived on the caravan park with people, really got to understand and work with them about what worked well each day, what went really well, how did they help each other out when there was a problem or an issue. And from that grew lots of solutions and lots of ways in which that community started taking things into their own hands, essentially, and finding the solutions that would matter to them, and built on their confidence of actually it's not all about us being all terrible and things being wrong with us. We've got lots of strengths and assets and things that we can do. And I think that narrative of always coming from there's things wrong with you and we're going to come in and fix it just keeps that, then becomes the story that everybody holds. So it's changing the story. So that whole way in which we communicate is really, really important. So that kind of summarises lots of the different areas. I won't go through them, but do have a look through and think about it. So what are strengths-based approaches? It's a big title, and it can mean lots of different things to different people, and there are lots of examples of it that we're already doing. And asset-based community development, which is a more community-up type approach, which Mick will say a lot more about later. When I was a student, now this, I'm telling you my age now, when I was a student social worker in 1976, one of the modules I did was community social work. And that was a whole year, actually, in those days. And a lot of it was rooted in some of the activism in the States, in Chicago and places like that, where they were dealing with really poor, disadvantaged neighborhoods. And a lot of the Saul Alinsky and Reveille for Radicals and all of that was the foundation to the kind of development of community approaches to how you work with individuals, families and communities. So that builds on that. And obviously it needs to be fit now for the 21st century, and we need to have a 21st century spin on it, and it's how you get even closer to working alongside people for those solutions to come from them and not from experts going in. So things have spun off from that. Local area coordination is something that is around in lots of local authorities now, and that was developed in Australia of all places, in Western Australia, which was very much because it's such a spread out population there. You couldn't have teams of people there ready to kind of respond to people. You had to think about different ways in which people could be linked to what might be possible in their little communities. So that's starting to gain more traction, and I was in Thurrock last week, and they were presenting to an international group of people from all over the world the way in which that local area coordination and strengths-based approach in Thurrock has made such a difference in terms of the outcomes that are being achieved for residents and communities there. So again, lots of people will have different experiences of it. I won't go through all of these, but some of them, so systemic social work, which is much more prevalent, I think, on the children's side. Again, when I was a frontline social worker working up in Bradford, I worked in a small team, and we covered one big estate. That was our job. There were 3 social workers and a social work assistant, and we had to do everything: mental health, children, everything you can think of. And of course it was going to be impossible for us, so we started to work as a team. We started to get involved with the family therapy team that worked in the education department, and started to think about a different way in which we engage with and work with communities and work jointly with each other, giving each other live supervision, if you like, when we were working with families, but also linking into the strengths that the greengrocer had, the local pharmacist, the head teacher of the primary school, because we had to create those virtual teams in those days. They didn't exist under these multidisciplinary, integrated service structures that we're now busily trying to embed and create. So that's the other thing to think about. On the ground, it's your relationships with the people you work with, both as people who are looking for or needing support and care, but also the other professionals or the other significant people in those communities. Family group conferencing, I know you're having a workshop on that today as well, well, I think there's a real opportunity to think much more about how we use family group meetings and conferences to identify what's possible and how you can utilise the strengths and resources and find the solutions that come from families. So I do hope we can see a lot more of that on the adult side, and where it has been used, I think it's been quite helpful. And I might go through all those others, but in some places the restorative practice approach, and I know Leeds has done that, but also in Greenwich, that's another good example to look at. And a lot of people are starting to use the 3 conversations model, which sounds very, what is it? Well, it's just a different way of starting the conversation in a way that I described to you earlier, and the different levels of conversation, and when you do have to get into, obviously, formal statutory needs assessments, and you do have to make sure you're compliant with the Care Act, but there are different ways of doing this work that can get away from a very procedural and dehumanising approach, I think. There's a very good research project that Bristol University are involved in, which is about people's experience of assessment. Now, if you go onto the School for Social Care Research Unit website, you can have a look at that, because they've got a really good video of people talking about their experience of assessment and how it felt when the first question was this or that, and how disabling it was, actually. So it's a real eye-opener, and I think we've got to much more be in tune all the time with what impact is this having on you? Is this helpful or not helpful? What are the things that are starting to undermine how you might feel about this stuff? So do have a look at that, and that's the other thing I think we need to get much better at, constantly reflecting on our practice, the impact it has on the person we're working with, and how we might improve it with feedback and honest reflections from them and ourselves. So, there are some good practice principles. I do think we need to have a really good understanding of the theory and practice that underpins this. What are the theories, models and frameworks we're using? How is that shaping your critical thinking and decision making? In my annual report, Clinton Farquharson, who is a West Midlands guy, a person who uses services but is also very involved in running services, one of the things he says is it's time to think and really critically reflect and work out more creative ways of working with people. He thinks that is the key thing that as social workers and social care practitioners we need to be much better at doing. And as I go around the country talking to people about this approach, that's the thing that seems to be the hook. I've finally got time to do what is real social work. I'm finally given permission to actually get to know the people I'm working with, create a trusting, build a trusting relationship with them, and start to explore at the right pace what might be possible. And I know that sometimes the productivity focus of volume of work and how you get through it and how quickly you get through it and what the outputs are can dominate. We've really got to challenge that, I think, because a lot of that time and money is wasted. It's often the wrong thing. How many times I've been into a person's house and they've got aids and adaptation type equipment stacked up in a corner, acting as a clothes dryer, because it wasn't co-designed or co-thought through with them. It wasn't going to fit what their lifestyle was and what was important to them. So we really need to think about taking the time, and I know that's a challenge because you're under a lot of pressure. The other thing is about, none of us can do any of this on our own. We're all working in multidisciplinary, virtual or real teams, and we've got to ensure that as social work or social care practitioners in those contexts, that you get the support and recognition you need for the unique things that you're bringing to that context. Nurses bring what they bring, physios bring what they bring, OTs, occupational therapists bring what they bring, doctors and nurses often dominate. So we've got to try and rebalance that, because that was the reason that we created the social work profession and social work practice in the first place, to try and counter what was often a very symptom treatment-led approach to working with people, because people do live in communities and that is what matters to them. We know now that connection, feeling part of something, being able to make a contribution, feeling valued within your communities and neighbourhoods or your family relationships is what really matters. And the whole issue about the modern problems of loneliness and isolation, depression and anxiety are rooted in that sense of aloneness and isolation and not feeling a part of something, or that you've got a contribution to make. So that confidence in working with individuals and families, I mean, these are the basic skills, I feel, that are around social work: listening, empathy, using stories to explore, reflecting, facilitating, collaborating with people, giving them the confidence to think about what might work. But you also have responsibility, obviously, as professionals with a lot of knowledge and experience, to provide advice, to share your knowledge, to integrate your knowledge with the knowledge of the person and the family you're working with. So there are the principles, I think. It's about strengths, interests, the knowledge and capabilities that you bring, really looking at the partnership approach and how you deal with power within that, that people do want to be self-reliant and responsible for their own journey and where they get to. That paternalistic approach, which is hard, isn't it? I was up in a northwest borough a few months ago, and most of the community lives in council housing or social housing, and for years, generations, the council has looked after them. So now that change in conversation, that shift to what's possible here and what can people take responsibility for themselves is so hard to make. When they used to, the chief exec was saying he had a phone call from somebody who rang up to say that there was a plastic bottle on the footpath outside his house, and could the council come round, pick it up and put it in the bin, please. You know, that idea of where they're to be looked after, the whole welfare state consensus after the war was obviously a significant step forward, but there's a point at which it needed to develop into something else, and we haven't quite made that leap, and Hilary Cotton's book is good to read about that. And that's what I was going on to say about everybody's got capacity to learn, grow and change, and we've seen that particularly through the movement around people with learning disabilities and the move from institutional care into more community-based care. Still a bit of a way to go, I think, in really achieving citizenship outcomes and inclusion outcomes for people, but much more has been achieved than I think we sometimes recognise. One of my first, when I had this job up in Bradford, one of the first people I worked with was a woman in her late 40s, early 50s, moving from a long-stay learning disability hospital over near Liverpool somewhere, back to Bradford, her community. She'd lived there from the age of about 9. She was with Down syndrome, and in those days everybody just got put in long-stay hospitals, institutions, and lived there for years. So that whole shift of, we don't do that anymore, we try and keep people supported and living in their communities. It's a big, big shift, and I think we've also seen how fantastically people can achieve so much so, for example, the Mayor of Selby is somebody with a learning disability and is quite able to manage and live a fully inclusive life in a way that we'd never have thought that 50 years ago, I don't think. They're the common themes, I think. It's a real critique, language matters, changing our lens, thinking about things differently. People are more than and different from their problems. Relationships, start with themselves and so on. Some of the criticisms sometimes that I get, and I'm sure you will all get as well, is, oh, well, this is just about, putting all, big society, saying, well, you look after yourself, pull yourselves up by your bootstraps, do it yourself. It's just an excuse for cutting programs, it's the whole neoliberal agenda, etc., etc. And that there can be a blame kind of element for things that people can't control. Structural disadvantage from immigration status or whatever it is. So they're the things to watch out for, I think. We've got to be really careful that we don't feed into that quite valuable sometimes. So, in using this approach, you've got to continually look at the power and political analysis of what you're doing. Poverty is not people's fault. We've got a whole system and structure that keeps some people in poverty. So part of our strengths-based approach is ensuring we can link and connect people to, ensuring that their income security is the best that it can be, in looking at other approaches to secure that. And also, I think, we've still got a responsibility to start to gather together evidence and as professionals lobby our politicians through the various routes that we can do that to try and advocate change. And we can't be over-optimistic, a bit Pollyanna-ish. Sometimes people say I'm a bit Pollyanna-ish, maybe I am. But that's the other thing. We can't be just optimistic and think this will solve everything. This is a silver bullet, because of course it's not. There are still many other things that we need to think about and deal with. And we can't use it to downplay the existence of real problems. And definitely, we cannot get into formulaic and prescriptive approaches, which is what sometimes worries me about 3 conversations. Well, here's your script, here are your questions, just go out there and ask all those questions. It's just a helpful tool. In the end, it relies on you, your critical thinking, your reflecting on things, your adapting and flexing your approach and changing the way you work with people depending on who they are. That requires kind of constant intellectual and practical application of your profession in different contexts. I'm not going to go through this, but I think it's really useful to look at some systemic family narrative approaches, because whilst that's very clinical and therapeutically oriented, it builds on a lot of these principles that people know their families and lives, they're the experts, you're collaborating with them, and so on. So a lot of these different areas of practice build on the same approaches and principles, just apply them slightly differently. So have a look at that. There's a lot more strengths-based approaches starting to develop in mental health practice, and this isn't just in social work and social care, but health professionals as well are starting to move towards recognising that the old route of what are your symptoms, oh this is your diagnosis, well we'll treat you in this way, is not working for most people, and certainly after 15, 20 years a heavy reliance on medication is becoming disabling in itself. So there's something about how we change the way mental health work is carried out as well, and I feel we've got a real responsibility as social workers and social care workers to try and influence mental health services, because they are predominantly delivered through NHS trusts, and I think there's something in there about how we get in there and have a lot more influence on that. Older people is our biggest group of people that we work with in adult social care, and I think we've got a long way to go to kind of changing the narrative about how we work with older people. And I think the strengths-based approach with older people is something that can really shift us away from simply looking at practically what support do people need, to recognising them as whole people and thinking about all the things that matter to them. Better recognition of their rich life experiences, how you enhance their quality of life, and how you promote their autonomy, even though often they may be physically very dependent on help and support. There's a sense of ways in which you can promote autonomy. So one of the things I think I want to really try and promote with people is thinking about social work practice with older people and how we build on this strengths-based approach to working with older people as well. So in terms of the organisational learning and development implications, one of the key messages, stop doing things to people. It usually doesn't work and it costs a lot more than it needs to, so it's how you do with. And that's the big strapline, I think. It's doing with and doing from, I think, is the next bit. Doing from what are the solutions or issues or things that matter to people. Really listening, and for organisations, listening to people who are getting in touch and wanting to get some advice or support or help, but also listening to you. How well are organisations listening to people who are out there day in and day out, interacting with citizens and working with them? Really reducing a lot of that kind of stuff around process. It was interesting, I was talking to the people who set out what data local authorities should collect, and I said, oh, you know, they've got to collect all this terrible data, and you make them do this, and you make them do that. They said, we only want the ASCOF outcomes, actually, we only want this bit, but local authorities come back and say, oh, well, we want to find out about this, and we want to do this, and the finance people want that, and the commissioners want that. So before you know it, you've got long forms that you're having to go through and tick this box and do that. So there's something about senior leadership and bottom-up input to think about, what do we really need to collect? How much time do we really want people sitting, writing and filling out forms, when the nature of our work is to be working with people? So there is a whole rebalancing there. I know it's really, really challenging, it's easy to say, but in some places they have done that. A radical review of, well, what is it we do at each step of the way? How do we get rid of waste that doesn't do anything? Because a lot of that data, I can tell you, nobody looks at it, nobody analyses it, nobody does anything with it. What's the point of it? So what matters as well is, what do you collect and why do you collect it, and how is that making a difference to the lives of people you meet, as well as obviously having to cover your legal requirements and your finance, probity and all the rest of it. But there is something about being a bit more creative and innovative in how we do that. I think the whole, I mean, this is part of it, isn't it? A whole new engagement with staff and how you have different conversations and really giving permission. I think that's one of the things that I noticed when I was in Leeds, actually, that Catherine, who's the director there, gave permission to the staff to just get out there and do what they're best at, and that you'll hear from social workers there how liberating and how creative and fantastic that's been. I've talked about isolation and loneliness and the key determinants of mental and physical ill health, so that connecting people, knowing what's available locally, being able to do that, we really need to do, and knowing and investing in communities, and we can say a bit more about that. But the neighbourhoods are still the essential building blocks of our public services, and we know how much people think going to their GP is going to be the access route to all these things. But then if you've been to your GP, you know you go there, you wait, you get your 5-10 minutes, and mine always says, you can only tell me 3 things today. So I've always got my long list of being a hypochondriac. So there's something about the GP, the family practitioner, used to be the person that people built the relationship with. Well, that model no longer works. So how do we enhance the family practice, primary care practice model to have the whole social determinants and social issues stuff built into it? And in my report, there's a really good example of a social work team working in a library and the impact that that's had. So do have a look at that as well. Digital's our next big challenge, and again, we've got a chief social worker in NHS Digital called Mark Nicholas, and he's trying to do a lot of work to improve digital capability in terms of social care and social work. How can we support social workers in their practice through better understanding and use of digital, both in terms of the day-to-day work, how you capture your conversations and work with people, how you communicate, and what might be some technological solutions as well for the future. And engaging with everybody, obviously, but the leadership team really have to support and believe this, as well as the bottom-up approach. So I think we've got a real collaboration to do with our directors of adult social services, but also our chief execs and others as well. So I'll finish there. I don't know if anybody has got any questions or comments, but I just want to end by saying I am really optimistic, actually, because when I first started in this role, one of the things I wanted to do was have a much sharper focus on actual practice in adult social care, because there was so much that was about process and home care and residential care and money and procurement and systems, that getting back to actually professional practice, what conversations go on between you and the people you work with and the neighbourhoods you work with, that should be what the focus is about. And we need to recognise that social workers and occupational therapists and physios and others and social care assessors who are working day in and day out are the real lever to making the difference in terms of what people's opportunities and possibilities are. And I think there's a real movement going across the country, partly fueled by the austerity agenda. And sometimes that happens, doesn't it? These things create a platform for thinking about how can we do things differently. Now, if you've got ideas, because I go back to the department and they're still sitting there thinking it's all about that, and I want to be able to give them examples of how just doing things in a different way, which doesn't cost a whole load of money, has helped shift the story and shift what happens for people. That would be really helpful. So thank you. Thanks for listening.